Welcome to Future Self Dreaming. My name is Carlos Castaneda. In previous presentations, I elaborated on some of my earlier initiatory experiences when training to become a facilitator of the ancient Egyptian mystery school teachings known as the Ancient Secret of the Flower of Life, a body of work that incorporates the knowledge and application of sacred geometry and how these principles relate to the human design. Prior to this, I outlined how I'd first come into contact with the Flower of Life material, which was through a series of synchronistic events that had been awakened due to my exploration of memories about an interaction that I'd had with the morning star as a young boy. In today's presentation, I'd like to continue sharing this journey with you by outlining further initiatory experiences that I had when traveling to Mexico to attend more of the advanced training with the Flower of Life organization. This journey was to unveil a deeper understanding of my relationship to the guidance of the morning star through the initiations that occurred. And to begin this presentation, I'd like to start with a quote from a book titled Black Elk Speaks, that is about the life story of a holy man from the Native American nation of the Oglala Sioux. This book it has several references to the morning star within the visions received by Black Elk, and it states, "Then the daybreak star was rising, and a voice said, 'It shall be a relative to them, and all who shall see it shall see much more, for thence comes wisdom, and those who do not see it shall be dark.' And all the people raised their faces to the east, and the star's light fell upon them, and all the dogs barked loudly, and the horses whinnied." So this part of my story began in 2003, several weeks before I was due to depart for Mexico, when the energy preceding the events that would take place in Mexico began to ramp up in preparation for this journey, and the synchronicities began to flow thick and fast. I'd been in Melbourne visiting friends for a week, and during one of my conversations with a friend who had also been an avid fan of the writings of Carlos Castaneda, he began to explain to me that there were several women who were part of Castaneda's inner circle who'd also written books about their shamanic apprenticeships with the Yaqui Indian sorcerer Don Juan Matus. He also explained that there was another woman named Marilyn Toonshond who was not part of this group led by Carlos Castaneda, but who had also written a book about her apprenticeship with Don Juan Matus, Castaneda's mentor. Now, sure enough, having never heard of her before, the next day while I was still in Melbourne, Marilyn's book appears before me while I was browsing through a bookstore. It is called Don Juan and the Power of Medicine Dreaming, a Nahuatl woman's journey of healing. So I took her book back to where I was staying and I engulfed it in a couple of days. In the book, Marilyn outlines how losing her fiancé in a tragic car accident had propelled her on a journey into Mexico where she'd first met Don Juan Matus. She knew Don Juan as a grandfather figure that had appeared in her childhood dreams, and after physically meeting him, Don Juan began to teach Marilyn dreaming techniques and practices for working with sexual energy. On her return journey from Mexico, she was tragically raped, and some years later found out that she'd contracted HIV from this encounter. And it was this discovery that compelled her to return to Mexico to Don Juan's tutelage, whereby she began to energetically cure herself of HIV. In her book, Marilyn describes encounters that she has through her dreaming practices with the being she identifies as Kukulkan, the God-man identified that I have mentioned earlier through tales associated with the morning star. Having been thoroughly inspired by the first read, I decided to read Marilyn's book again the week before I departed for Mexico. When I returned home to Byron Bay from Melbourne, I attended a market in a small village called the Shannon with a girlfriend, and while looking through a second-hand bookstore, I found a book called The Rise of the Morning Star, The Return of the Love Goddess by Vincent Selick. This book was described as an interpretation of the cultural myths about the planet Venus and the associated goddesses of love such as Aphrodite, as well as the influence of these myths on the resurgence of feminine spirituality. The book acknowledged that the many cultures throughout the centuries that have revered Venus as the morning and evening star, which has aroused emotions and captivated mystical attention. So I was excited to find a book about the morning star, and I went on to explain to my friend the story that I have elaborated on in a previous presentation about my encounter with the morning star at about age 10, and the resultant synchronicities that led me to the Flower of Life teachings when I began to investigate this encounter later as a young man. These experiences had all led to the point that I was currently at, which was where I was about to attend the next advanced training in Mexico for the Flower of Life organization in preparation for becoming a facilitator of that body of work. So we continued to stroll around the markets, and we came to another secondhand bookstore, and my friend, knowing that I was about to depart for Mexico, picked up a Lonely Planet guide to Mexico, and she opened it randomly and was surprised to find at the very top of the page the first words stated "the morning star," just after I'd explained my encounter with the morning star as a child to her. So she handed me the page of the book, and I began to read, and this page had a reference to the morning star temple at a site at the ancient city of Tula in Mexico. As I read more, I discovered that Tula was the capital of central Mexico's second great civilization, the Toltec Empire, located about 65 kilometers from Mexico City. There were references in this Lonely Planet guide to the leader of the Empire of Tula being associated with Quetzalcoatl, the Aztec name for the feathered serpent, otherwise known by the Mayan culture as Kukulkan. The stories of his departure from Tula include Quetzalcoatl, Kukulkan, departing to the Gulf Coast, putting on his turquoise mask and Quetzal feather headdress, and setting himself on fire, becoming the morning star in doing so. The other story of his departure is that he sailed from the coast on a raft made of snakes, promising to one day return. So given the synchronicity of these events, finding a book about the morning star at the markets, followed by the references to the morning star in the Lonely Planet guide, I decided that I must visit this temple complex at the Toltec city of Tula while visiting Mexico. Well, a few days later, while browsing books in another local bookstore, I noticed a book by an author named William Henry, who describes himself as an investigative mythologist. I opened the book, and there in front of me was the word Tula, the same name as the city that I had discovered in the Lonely Planet guide to Mexico. Tula had a symbol that represented it, looking like the zodiac symbol for Libra. So fascinated by this synchronicity, I read on to find out that Tula is a term for the center of the Milky Way galaxy, otherwise known to the Mayan people of ancient Mexico as the Hunab Ku, or the galactic core. And as described by William Henry, Tula, being a reference to the center of the Milky Way, is also known as the land of milk and honey, the place where souls are birthed. He says that no matter where the word Tula appears throughout various cultures around the world, it represented the Great Mother and her law that dominated the thinking of the ancients, who believed that our souls came from Tula and our mission on earth was to learn to return to Tula. According to Greek myths, the heart of Tula beats and the vibrations spread throughout the galaxy from this central sun, Tula being a foundation of healing energy, and that it's even considered to be the Holy Grail itself. So these synchronicities kept occurring when a few days later, while sitting on the toilet, otherwise known as the throne of contemplation, I was glancing through a music magazine, and I began pondering my connection with the morning star in finding these books at the markets and the reference to the city of Tula and its relationship to the galactic center. So with aroused curiosity, I decided that it might be a good idea to explore what information I could find on the internet about the morning star. So I typed in a search for the morning star on the internet, and before long I found myself at a Golden Dawn website that had connections to the Order of the Morning Star. I was mildly familiar with the Order of the Golden Dawn from other literature that I'd previously read, and the Golden Dawn describes its function as guardians of the Western mystery traditions, which include the study of Kabbalah, tarot, and spiritual alchemy. However, I'd never made any connection to the Golden Dawn with the morning star. And as I continued to look at the webpage for the Golden Dawn's Order of the Morning Star, I noticed a symbol that I was sure that I had just seen somewhere. So I raced back up into the toilet and found the music magazine that I'd been looking at. And scrambling through the pages, I found the image that I was looking for. I'd taken a particular interest in a tattoo on the drummer from a band called Mudvayne, and this tattoo was the same symbol that I had seen on the homepage for the Order of the Morning Star, as well as another symbol for Kundalini energy as a serpent rising up a pole. And I figured something in my consciousness that was connected to the morning star had a relationship to these occult teachings from Western mystery school traditions, and that perhaps this had been a trigger by seeing the symbol in that magazine. So the next website I found really blew me away, because I discovered a man who had shared an extremely similar experience to myself with the morning star. It was a site of a man named J.C. Husfeld, who led spiritual journeys around the world and had established a spiritual teaching organization called the Morning Star Institute. The most notable aspect of the information regarding the morning star on his website was the way that JC had first come in contact with the morning star. He had an experience one night after having performed ceremonies on the big island of Hawaii, and his information detailed that he was not sure whether he was dreaming or awake when he had witnessed Venus as the morning star, and a heavenly voice had spoken to him telling him that this star is you, you are this star. After this, one of the Hawaiians that he had been performing ceremonies with told him that during the previous night's ceremony, one of his Hawaiian ancestors had come to him dressed in full warrior regalia and told him that JC was a kahuna, a prophet bringing back lost knowledge and sacred teachings that had been misunderstood, forgotten, and corrupted. The next page in JC's website that I opened was all about my old buddy Archangel Michael, and I realized that the order was actually called the Morning Star Order of the Archangel Michael. JC's experiences almost exactly paralleled my own, and seeing the connection that he had to Archangel Michael, I felt a deep resonance. JC describes angels as having been referred to as morning stars, as they represent the light emerging from the darkness. Having a sense of kinship and wanting to meet this man, I ordered his book to find out more, which is called The Return of the Feathered Serpent, Shining Light of First Knowledge. So several weeks later, I arrive in Mexico to attend the Seed of Life 2 training in Ixtapa. And I may describe more of the encounters that I had during this training in another presentation, which had included a lot of direct interspecies interaction with dolphins, involving Kundalini activation through Qigong exercises, meditation, and breathwork. However, towards the conclusion of this week-long workshop, one of the facilitators, Lisa, who I have mentioned in an earlier presentation, who acts as a trance channel for an intelligence from the Pleiades known as Sasha, gave a channeling session. And during this channeling session, we had the opportunity to ask questions. And so, given the synchronicities that I had had in the weeks prior to the workshop, I asked about my connection to the morning star. And the reply that I received was that it was a connection that I'd had in previous lifetimes of involvement with ancient mystery schools, and that I had a very good way of discovering these connections for myself. So given the unfolding synchronicities in the weeks prior, I accepted that as being the case. Given my fascination with Carlos Castaneda's writings about his experiences of shamanic apprenticeship that had taken place in Mexico, it surprised me that Mexico had not been somewhere that I'd thought to travel previously. But as a result of the Flower of Life training taking place there, I had several weeks after the workshop to explore Mexico and visit many of the ancient temple sites. At that time, I had a preconception about the Mexican landscape being simply a cactus-filled desert, but the countryside was much more diverse than I'd expected. And at that time, I did not know much about the ancient history of the temples, which weren't much of a focus of Carlos Castaneda's writings. Coincidentally, during the time that I was to be in Mexico, an event in New Age circles that became known as the Harmonic Concordance was to transpire on November the 8th, 2003, where 6 planets in our solar system would align in the formation of a star tetrahedron, otherwise known as the Star of David, which was to be combined simultaneously with a full lunar eclipse visible from Mexico. This event was being heralded by astrologers as part of a global shift of consciousness, a galactic alignment that would open a multi-dimensional portal of divine consciousness. So the first temples that I visited in Mexico was Teotihuacan, just outside Mexico City, that features a massive pyramid dedicated to Kukulkan, covered in stone carvings of the feathered serpent. The first structure that I walked towards was the platform of Venus, or the morning star, that was located in the middle of the citadel. And after conferring with the others in my group that I was traveling with after the Flower of Life workshop, we decided that this was an appropriate location for an opening ceremony together. Not realizing it at the time, I later came to understand that the Aztecs and Mayan people had these platforms to Venus at all of their major temple complexes, and they tracked the entire Venus cycle, 263 days as the morning star, 50 days absent, 263 days as the evening star, and finally 8 days absent, taking 584 days in total, an interval also known as the synodic period of Venus. So I was staying in a backpacker hostel in the center of Mexico City near the main center known as the Zócalo that features a church built from the stones of another ancient temple site called Tenochtitlan. During this stay, I also had the opportunity to visit the Museum of Antiquities. And whilst at the museum, I remembered references that Carlos Castaneda and the Bringers of the Dawn books had made about the ability to shift our point of perception by being in the presence of some of the ancient stone monuments at sacred sites. So I spent as much time as possible around these artifacts in the museum, including many feathered serpent statues of Kukulkan or Quetzalcoatl, as well as the Aztec sunstone calendar. When my friends that I'd been traveling with from the Flower of Life workshop departed the group, I decided it was time to visit the city of Tula that had so obviously made itself known in the Lonely Planet Guide to Mexico. The guide explained that Tula was the ancient capital of the Toltec civilization, and that the Toltec style of construction in their temple building had a great influence upon other great Mexican civilizations such as the Mayan and the Aztec people. I had only been aware of the term Toltec from having read some of Carlos Castaneda's novels and from the dream that I'd had whilst visiting Egypt the year before. It had not even occurred to me that there was a civilization of people known as the Toltecs until I visited the Anthropological Museum the previous day. I used a small map of the complex at Tula to orientate myself, and I made my way towards the Venus Morning Star platform to perform an opening ceremony as I had done at Teotihuacan. I later discovered that each day that I had visited these temples and performed these ceremonies, there had been massive solar flares that had been erupting, which affected the Earth's electromagnetic field. There were only a handful of other people strolling around, and the silence within the complex at Tula was very calming in the desert. So atop the Venus platform that morning, I pondered just exactly what was the influence that had brought me there. It seemed quite amazing that several weeks earlier, a chain of synchronicities would have me arrive at the location that I was now at. And so in meditation, I silently asked for continued guidance from the morning star during my further travels into Mexico during the weeks ahead. Leaving the Venus platform, I ascended up a stairway to the top of the main pyramid at Tula, which is also known as the Temple of the Morning Star. At the top of this pyramid stand 4 large human statues depicting Quetzalcoatl or Kukulkan in full warrior regalia, symbolizing him in the guise of the Morning Star. I read more of my Lonely Planet Guide for information on these impressive statues that were known as Atlantes and had once held up the roof of the temple. I remembered having seen one of these statues the previous day while visiting the museum. One of the original statues had been removed and placed in the museum, and I decided it would be a good idea to sit back to back with one of these stone monuments at Tula and meditate with them for a while. So I'd wanted the opportunity to be away from all the tourists in silence with one of these stone statues like the Atlantes, which were in the museum. And being at Tula gave me that opportunity. So I did my Merkaba meditation, breath activation, and then sat silently looking out over the mountains that surrounded Tula, pondering this view of the landscape that I had now shared with the ancient Toltecs from 1,000 years earlier. Whilst meditating with this statue, I secretly wished that while in Mexico I would meet a shaman like Don Juan Matus, the Mexican sorcerer who had been Carlos Castaneda's mentor, which was somewhat of a romantic fantasy after several years of enjoying Castaneda's books. I also considered that in just over a week's time there was to take place this rare celestial alignment, which in the New Age circles had become known as the harmonic concordance, and that in conjunction with this alignment was to be a full moon eclipse that was going to be visible whilst in Mexico. So I was sitting atop the temple of Quetzalcoatl back to back with this stone Atlanti, and I secretly hoped that I would meet some shaman who I could share this experience of the eclipse with. Again, I knew very little about the sacred sites of Mexico at that time, other than a few common names of some of the main temple complexes that I'd planned to visit. I knew that I wanted to travel to the Yucatan Peninsula on the east coast, and my intuition was compelling me towards being at the site of Chichen Itza during the time of the eclipse. The Lonely Planet guide stated that the Toltec Empire had a large influence on the construction of the temples at Chichen Itza, so it seemed appropriate that I head in that direction. After I returned to Mexico City, I then traveled to Tulum on the Caribbean coast, where I spent time by the ocean practicing dreaming techniques and Qigong before heading to Chichen Itza for the eclipse. And when I arrived at the village not far from the site of Chichen Itza's ruins, my bus passed a motel called the Pyramid Inn, and I considered staying there purely for namesake. However, as soon as the bus pulled in, I was greeted by a friendly owner of the motel next door who encouraged me to stay with him at a very reasonable rate. I was wanting to save my visit to the ruins of Chichen Itza until the following day when the eclipse occurred, so I opted for spending the afternoon strolling around the village to orientate myself before returning to my motel room to meditate. Well, when I began to meditate that evening, I began with practicing the Merkaba meditation, breathing, and I sensed this pranic energy coming through me that was exceedingly clear like crystal, and I very quickly found myself in a deep state of meditation with minimal effort. And I began to feel mildly disorientated and confused, and then I had this rather distinct and strong sensation that somebody was sitting on the bed directly opposite me. And knowing that there was nobody else physically in the room with me, I decided to ask whatever being was present with me to reveal itself. And the moment that I asked this question, the image of a bird-headed man sitting on the bed before me appears in my mind. So I mentally ask whether this being has anything that it wishes to tell or convey to me, but I did not get any response other than the feeling that it simply wanted me to be aware of its presence. So when I was once again back in my normal state of awareness, I was very quick to dismiss this meditative image as some fanciful construction of my mind with no great relevance. However, after I surfaced from the meditation, I decided to lay down and continue reading some of a book that one of my friends at the workshop had given me called The Hathor Material by Tom Kenyon. And I was oddly surprised to begin immediately reading about the Egyptian god Horus, who is portrayed as a bird-headed man. The Hathor Material elaborated on the concept of Egyptian alchemy as a process of raising kundalini and resurrecting one's consciousness beyond the realms of duality or illusion into a state of unified, non-dual, omnipresent and eternal peace. So this alchemical process was metaphorically described in the text through the myth of the resurrection of Osiris. So the following morning, I leapt out of bed with great anticipation of the eclipse that evening, and after breakfast I eagerly set off with my backpack to walk towards the temple site at Chichen Itza. And upon entering the site, I referred to the map of the grounds from my Lonely Planet guide, and I soon found the Temple of Venus, or the Morning Star, for my opening ceremony. So I'd arrived early before the flood of tourist buses, and this also allowed me to climb to the top of the main pyramid known as the El Castillo, where there were relatively few other people around at that time. And when I reached the top and turned to inspect the view, I was greeted by this magnificent rainbow above the tree line, which stretched as far as the eye could see. This pyramid in the center of the main complex at Chichen Itza was called El Castillo after the Spanish conquistadors who thought it resembled a castle. However, it is actually the Kukulkan Pyramid, most famous due to the shadow of a serpent that can be witnessed descending from the heavens to earth down the staircase of the pyramid during the solstices each year, when the light and dark of the day are at the longest and shortest periods. So not knowing much about Chichen Itza, I again referred to my Lonely Planet guide to find that I was standing atop the Kukulkan Pyramid, which is actually a calendar built in stone. And after taking in the magnificent view from the top of the pyramid, I climbed down and noticed that it was possible to enter into the structure from a doorway beneath one of the staircases. So as I entered, a guide explained that there was a smaller pyramid constructed within the larger one, and that it was dedicated to the moon, while the larger one was to the sun. So I walked up the narrow stairwell to the top of the smaller pyramid inside the large one and found myself inside a chamber looking at a jaguar throne situated in the center of a dark and musty room within this pyramid. Upon returning out into the sunlight outside the Kukulkan Pyramid, I tagged along amongst one of the tourist groups so that I could listen to the guide explain the function of the temples. I then branched off from the tourist group that I'd been following and made my way down a dirt path for several hundred meters, which led to a sacred waterhole known as a cenote. It was this water well that gave the city of Chichen Itza its name, meaning well of the Itza being the name for the Mayan people of that land. I read that the sacred well had long been a place of worship and an area to make offerings to the gods, and at one stage in the history of the city, human sacrifices had possibly been made there. Now, near the cenote, I found a small shop selling a very small book written in English titled Chichen Itza, the Cosmic University of the Mayas. I opened it to page 45, chapter 6, titled The Temple of Venus, the Morning Star, which read, "The place where, arriving at the break of day, the Mayans could rise to see the face of God. The dawn is the precise moment when very special energies vibrate that proceed from the cosmos. Kukulkan Quetzalcoatl is a truly genuine man of wisdom, and according to legend, it is said that he converted into the morning star." So it was while at this sacred well and reading this book that I began to have a sense of déjà vu and the strange impression that I somehow knew the scene that was before my eyes. And as one of the tour guides explained the human sacrificial ritual, I began to recall imagery from the book that I had read just prior to departing Australia, Don Juan and the Power of Medicine Dreaming, by the female shaman named Marilyn Toonchond, who had been under the tutelage of Carlos Castaneda's mentor Don Juan Matus. I recalled her references to the dreams of Kukulkan throughout this book and thought that this must have been how I recalled the place that I was now sitting at after having read the book. After another hour or so spent inspecting the buildings in the main plaza at Chichen Itza, I walked from an area known as the Group of 1,000 Columns down a dirt path and through an area that had much more tree growth, and it led me to some much older looking buildings. And the area I was now in had a much different feel to it than the more modern area of the main plaza. And as I entered this area, I became very aware of the change in energy there. It felt almost like I had walked through a veil or barrier of energy that divided the old Chichen Itza from the new. So upon entering the ancient grounds and noticing this shift of energy through my body, I strolled over to a stone structure and noticed that it was another much older platform of Venus, or the morning star. And although there was a sign posted next to the platform outlining its function as a Venus platform, it had not been identified on the map of the grounds that I had with me. So I took my time inspecting the stone carvings on the wall of the platform and then read the information on the sign about this structure. And I began to give tobacco offerings as I had done at the other Venus platforms. After this ceremony, I began strolling away when I noticed these two women approaching that I'd seen wandering past me a couple of times during that morning. And as they drew nearer, the most astounding occurrence began, because the younger of the women stated to her mother, "Hey Mum, look, it's my temple, the temple of the morning star. It's me, the morning star." And I was somewhat surprised by the woman's comment, so I turned around and asked her about it, saying hesitantly, I heard you, just overheard you saying something about the morning star. Do you mind me asking what your connection to the morning star is? And she stated that she was the morning star, that was her name, quite proudly and confidently, having a puzzled look on her face in response to my question. And my response to her was, well, in that case, so am I. It was with a conviction that I'd never had before in identifying myself so strongly as the morning star, yet it seemed totally appropriate for me addressing this woman. And she asked, "You are?" And we were somewhat puzzled by this interaction that we were having. And I then began asking her, "Can you explain more about your association with the morning star?" And she begins to tell me the exact same experience that I'd had as a child, explaining that her connection she'd had when she was awakened as a child to the light of the morning star, who had told her that she was part of this light. And I'm looking at her in utter disbelief, and began elaborating on my story. So this encounter that we were having was like having found some long-lost relative, and I was keen to explain everything I knew about the morning star to her and know more about her experiences. I told her where I lived, about the Flower of Life course, coming to Mexico with this guidance of the morning star that had been guiding me around the various ancient temples and sites through Mexico. And she explained that she was originally from America but had been living in the Yucatan for several years, working with a number of women in the area to help clean up the karmic residue throughout the land from the previous human sacrifices. So as the two of us elaborated on our childhood memories, I began to have this strange idea that maybe this woman was actually the shaman woman whose book I'd read, named Marilyn Toonshond, and that it would be very exciting if it was. And because of the nature of our encounter, and because she had gone by the name Morning Star, I thought that I needed to ask her what her name was. And I said to her, "What did you say your name was? It's not Marilyn, is it?" And she said, no, my name is Morning Star." She'd had it changed years ago because she began to associate more strongly with the energy of the morning star than her original name, and explained that she believed that there were many people on the planet that knew themselves as the morning star, and that it was a return of the energies of Venus and the associated goddess. So I apologized. I said, I know that your name is Morning Star. You explained that to me, but I've just read this woman named Marilyn's book, and have you ever heard of her? She's a shaman woman. And she hadn't. But Morning Star began to explain to me that there were some really amazing women in the area, and one of them was named Carol, who actually owned the Pyramid Inn. And I explained that I knew where that was because I was staying in the motel next door. And so she suggested that I go and visit Carol while I was there. We talked a little bit about the eclipse that evening, and then I departed, giving her a crystal. And I walked back to my motel completely blown away by the synchronicity of meeting another person who had also shared the same encounter with the morning star that I'd had as a child at the Temple of the Morning Star in Chichen Itza, and also reflected on how similar her experiences had been to the man J.C. Husfeld, whose book I mentioned earlier. So after checking out the remaining ruins of the old Chichen Itza, several hours passed, and my appetite was motivating me to head back to my motel for some lunch. And as I walked past the Pyramid Motel, I remembered that Morning Star had mentioned that I should connect with the owner there named Carol, so I decided to heed this guidance, and I entered the motel asking one of the waitresses if Carol was available. Her husband came out, and soon Carol joined us, and she began to show me around the motel and offer me rooms that were available to stay in. And I decided to have some lunch outside at the dining area in the restaurant there. And while waiting for my meal, I noticed a large mural on the wall at the end of the hallway that was advertising Mayan massage, and which was exactly what I needed after several weeks of carting around a heavy backpack. So I returned from the restaurant to visit Carol and ask if anyone was giving massage that day. And she introduced me to a small Mexican woman whose name was Gloria. And she informed me that she was about to work on a client, and so I organized to have a massage about an hour later after lunch. So during my meal in this restaurant, I start to notice this group of men that were sitting a short distance away, and I became intrigued with the way they were interacting with each other. They seemed like an odd group to be associating together, and it appeared as though they were planning something. And I was interested in what they were up to. I had the distinct feeling that they were some type of spiritual group, and I considered going to approach them, but they got up and left before I had the opportunity to do so. So I'm enjoying a cup of tea after lunch, and then I go to have my massage at 3 o'clock. And when I returned to the massage room, Gloria explains that she had another client booked and could I come back in another hour's time. So I agreed to return. I go for a stroll uptown, and when I come back at 4 o'clock, Gloria explains that she needs some more time to do something and asks me to come back in another hour. So I'd waited a couple of hours, but I was very keen to have this massage and wasn't perplexed by her request, so I come back an hour later. And as I come back to the massage room, the moon was just starting to rise above the horizon. And for several days previous, the sky had been filled with clouds, and they had all begun to disappear just as the moon was beginning to arise. And as I entered the room for the massage, I asked Gloria whether she knew that there was an eclipse imminent that night. And she says to me excitedly, yes, the eclipse is at 6:30. And I said, oh, okay, you know about the eclipse. She couldn't speak much English. I couldn't speak much Spanish. And I explained that I thought that it was later at about 10 o'clock. And she says to me, no, 6:30. And so I said, oh, well, we have enough time for the massage before the eclipse begins. And she says, yes, we'll finish in time. So we begin the massage, and after about 20 minutes or so, just as I'd begun to deeply relax, there's this knock, knock, knock on the door. And some voices from outside ask, Gloria, are you in there? And so she excuses herself, goes out of the room, chats with these people for a moment, and then comes back in very excited, saying to me, oh, very exciting. Tonight we sneak into the pyramids to watch the moon eclipse. And I was saying, okay, you're going into the pyramids tonight? And she says, yes. And so I said, can I come? Thinking I'm going to seize this opportunity. And she says, yes, we go when we finish the massage. So I wasn't too concerned at that point whether we finished the massage or not, but I enjoyed the remainder of it. And I was dumbstruck by this opportunity that had presented itself to sneak in through the jungle into the pyramids with this Mexican woman. And it seemed like there had been no accident that my massage had been repeatedly delayed throughout the afternoon. So when we finished the massage, I wasted no time in putting my clothes back on. And even though Gloria assured me that there was no hurry, she left the room briefly to consult with these people and came back to get me. And we went out the front of the motel, and there, standing at the front of the motel, was about 20 men, some of which I had seen in the restaurant that afternoon. And I recognized these men. They began looking at me, kind of wondering who I was. And a couple of them came up to me asking how I had been there. And I just said, I'm with this Mexican woman, Gloria. And then I hear the voice of another woman who was the only other woman amongst this group of 20 men, telling everyone to listen up. And one of the men asked me how I'd come to be there and whether I knew Marilyn. And I looked at him and said, Marilyn Toonshond. And he says, yes, that's her over there. And so all of a sudden I realized that I have entered into this group of men with the woman, Marilyn Toonshond, whose book I had read just before I had departed for Mexico. And the moon was just beginning to eclipse. And we were about to sneak into the pyramids with this Mayan Mexican woman who was going to act as our guide through the jungle. And some of the men began to ask where I was from, how I'd come to be there. Did I know Marilyn? Had I read her book? Did I know the work of Carlos Castaneda? And I was so buzzing with excitement and thinking that this was so weird that I had entered into this group. Began talking rapidly out of this nervous excitement, wanting to relay everything to them about my journey, of how I'd got there, and that I was just thinking that day whilst I was at Chichen Itza, speaking to this woman called the Morning Star who shared the same energy as me as a child, wondering whether she was Marilyn, and now here I was sneaking through the forest with these men. So my excitement was so great that I could hardly breathe while I was still babbling nonstop and explaining that I'd hoped to secretly meet some shaman who would take me into the pyramids to watch the moon eclipse. So the men explained that they had been doing a week-long intensive with Marilyn that was primarily focused on Toltec dreaming practices and energetic purification through sweat lodge and breathing techniques, and meeting other local shaman who Marilyn introduced them to. And I continued to walk with some of these men in the third party. We had broken up into 3 groups, and the moon was just beginning to eclipse as we were walking to our destination, and my heart was racing. I was feeling so abuzz with energy that I felt like I was about to leap out of my skin, and that there was this intense quickening occurring in my body as the vibration had gone to a new level as the moon was beginning to eclipse. I was eager to know everything that I could about Marilyn and what she'd been teaching these men during their workshop. So we walked for a short distance through the forest until we entered the older area of Chichen Itza that I had explored that afternoon. And I knew exactly where we were located and where we were going, and so some of the others were slightly confused as to which path to take, and I just began running through the forest in the darkness, lit by the light of the full moon, and until we got to this area that was an ancient astrological observatory. And we entered the field in front of this observatory to this amazing view of the expansive night sky before us that was revealing the eclipsing moon among this star-filled heavens. So, although many of the stars were dimmed by the light of the full moon, my favourite constellation, the Pleiades, was shining in full vision. And the members of the first two groups had already arrived at the observatory, and we began to ascend the flights of stairs to join them. And as we looked back down to the bottom level of the observatory, the forest was glowing in this eerie red light of the eclipsing moon. And everyone sat in total silence for the next couple of hours during the duration of the eclipse. And I tried to still my excited internal chatter with breathing so I could become more fully present throughout the entirety of this experience. I realized that the hand of spirit had guided me to be there for this sacred event, and I wanted to savor every moment. As I mentioned, the thick cloud cover that had been filling the sky for several days prior to the eclipse had all but vanished, and it was just leaving haunting wisps of cloud that drifted around the night sky. And I lay on my back on top of the observatory looking up towards the moon as it was embracing the shadow of the earth. There was nothing to do, there was nowhere to be other than just to simply enjoy this heavenly transition that was unfolding with Marilyn and the group that I had found myself with. And after staring at the moon for quite a while, I realized that I was in a quite pleasant trance-like state. And towards the later stages of the eclipse, I found this trance-like attention being slowly drawn to a wisp of cloud that looked like a wriggling snake that was descending its way through the heavens towards the moon. And as it approached the moon, I became fascinated with how much this scene in the heavens resembled a sperm wriggling its way towards an egg. And to my surprise, just as this sperm cloud met the moon, a shooting star burst straight up the tail of the cloud or the sperm. And in this slow trance-like awareness that I was in, this was quite startling, and it sent a shiver up my spine. And there was a connection in my mind and my body during this phenomena that was occurring about the electrical nature of Kundalini, life force that was the energy that was shooting through the shooting star and up the back of my spine at the same time. And the image in the heavens seemed like it was some sort of omen or sign about some sort of cosmic impregnation that was taking place. Now, shortly thereafter, just as the eclipse was coming to a close, another larger mass of clouds begins to drift down towards the moon, and as I shift my gaze and attention towards it, the image of the cloud that begins to form in the sky became truly astonishing as it forms the figure of the bird-headed man that I'd encountered in my meditation the previous day. And I was thinking to myself, witnessing this, am I just making this shit up? Am I just seeing whatever I want to see in the shapes and patterns of the clouds? Is it just my unconscious mind projecting what it wants to see onto these clouds? And why would I see this Birdman that I saw in my meditation in the clouds last night? What purpose would that serve? Anyway, I acknowledged that the resemblance was the same. And at the completion of the eclipse, the men began to stand up and begin to stretch and wander around the top of this complex, which was a very similar shape to modern-day astrological observatories. Our guide and masseuse, Gloria, began speaking softly in Spanish to Marilyn, who then translated what she was telling to the rest of the group. And she was explaining that there were these large holes around the top of the observatory that were once filled with water, and that these chambers filled with water acted as mirrors to the heavens, where the Mayan astronomers could gaze into them and chart their astrological alignment of the stars. So I began to stroll around the outside of this large dome at the top of the observatory with the other men behind me, and I entered into the back entrance of this structure. And as I began to walk into the building, I turned around to look at the men following me and had the most overwhelming sense of deja vu that I think I've ever had. It nearly knocked me off my feet. And it was as though I had had this initiatory experience before. I knew the faces of the men who were following me into the building. I was walking amongst some strange energetic experience that I was aware that I had dreamed myself into over previous weeks that had led me to this point. And the intensity of the moment was such that it almost overwhelmed me with this strange fright. And I began to pull myself together as I entered this building. The moment passed and we transitioned through the other side of the building out to the steps leading to the ground level at the bottom of the observatory. And when all the group had amassed and assembled at the bottom of the observatory, we began to make our way across this courtyard. And I took a last glance at the moon above the observatory, only to find that the thick cloud cover had once again covered the sky, and Marilyn gleefully comments that the show was over and that the curtains had closed on this energetic event. And I was extremely grateful to whatever force it was that had allowed the heavens to open for such an auspicious event. So the group arrives back at the motel and we congregate outside the restaurant for a late night supper, and I finally had the chance to introduce myself to Marilyn, as we'd been in silence the whole evening. And I thanked her for allowing me to be part of this group at such last minute notice, and she acknowledged that I'd been there the whole time from the beginning, following the energy that led me into that event. And I acknowledged that I had no idea how I'd been so fortunate, and that some divine guidance was obviously working with me to get there. And she laughed gleefully as she acknowledged that certainly there must have been this guidance to be there as part of what had taken place. So there was so much that I wanted to elaborate on with Marilyn, and so there were many questions that I had to ask of her, and I began explaining everything that had occurred over the previous weeks that had led me to be there with her group that evening, including this ongoing guidance of the morning star and its relationship to Kukulkan. I told her about just having read her book the week before departing Australia and how I'd remembered it earlier that day while at Chichen Itza. I told her about the flower of life and the Merkaba meditation. We spoke about experiences with interdimensional beings, bilocation, and the dream that I'd had about Don Juan Matus while traveling in Egypt the previous year. And she smiled and grinned as she listened, and although was very enthusiastic about what we were discussing, none of it seemed surprising to her, as it had become her way of being in the world. So we chatted for some time before rejoining the group for this late night supper, and we all stayed up until the early hours of the morning in conversation, and I immensely enjoyed the integrity and authority and conviction with which Marilyn spoke, and marvelled at how I had been secretly wishing to sit atop some pyramids during this celestial alignment that had magically found me and found me with one of the remaining apprentices from Don Juan Matus's lineage of Toltec sorcerers. So before bed that evening after the eclipse event, I organised to meet with some of the men from Marilyn's group the following morning. I met them for breakfast, and then we caught a taxi out to a sacred underground cenote and cave system located about an hour's drive away. And I'd had a dream a couple of nights previous about being in a cave and mentioned this to the men, and they elaborated on some of the practices that they'd learned with Marilyn, one of them having particular relevance being a practice known as dream bridging, where a person aims to bridge the energy of the dream with the waking world, and in so doing gaining medicine and wisdom. The example that they described was finding a particular object in the dream which one must then strive to find in the waking world by intending to do so and allowing the energy body to guide you intuitively towards that. In my case that day, I dreamed about being in a cave and was on my way to visit the first of several that day. The men also explained to me the procedures for performing the fire breath, an exercise for drawing kundalini up the spine, and throughout the energy centers of the body, which were extremely similar to the practices and energy breathing techniques that I'd learned at the Flower of Life Advanced Workshop several weeks earlier. After returning from our visit to the caves, we walked into town to find some food and have a look around, and I needed some more film for my camera at the time, and so we stopped at a souvenir store located at the front of another motel. This shop was loaded with tourist memorabilia, and my attention was drawn towards a table that was filled with books, and the only one on that table that was written in English rather than Spanish stood out to me, and this book was called The Mysteries of Chichen Itza, the first guide to the esoteric function of the temples and pyramids of ancient Chichen Itza, authored by Alberto Rivera. So I picked up this book and opened it to a page in the middle, and the first words that I glanced at were the Eagle Men. And I got an instant rush of exhilaration, remembering the bird-headed man that had been present during my meditation 2 nights earlier, and who I again saw in the clouds at the end of the eclipse. I thought that perhaps the synchronicities had come to their peak at the time of the eclipse, yet it appeared that there were much more to be unveiled and discovered about who these Eagle Men of Chichen Itza were. The book outlined that Chichen Itza was the most important center for esoteric initiations in all of the Americas, and that the initiates would travel from far and wide to partake in the knowledge of science, art, philosophy, and metaphysics that was taught there. It was the home of the solar cult of Serpent and Phallus, which predated to the time of Atlantis and had spread not only to the Americas but to Egypt, Greece, India, and parts of Asia. Each of the different temples at Chichen Itza played an important role in the initiation rites of those who partook in them. These temples were training grounds where initiates were tested physically and psychologically, aspiring to slay the animal nature or personal desire represented by the jaguar, and in victoriously slaying their egotistic nature they would become one with the life of spirit in service to all, represented by the symbol of the eagle. They were trained in the mastery of their sexual energy, in raising kundalini life force through the body to access the higher teachings of spirit, alchemically creating a finer state of vibration in doing so. And once the spirit had conquered the flesh, initiates became known as true men, bird, serpent men, eagle warriors, Quetzalcoatl, Halik eunuch, Quetzalcans, Kukulkan, or simply as serpents. The image that represents Quetzalcoatl or Kukulkan is that of the feathered or plumed serpent. It is the image of the snake covered in feathers of the beautiful Quetzal bird. Part of this mythological symbology relates to the serpent that moves along the ground with its forked tongue representing the earthly level of consciousness that perceives reality through the perception of duality, seeing everything as split into conflicting opposites. However, when this serpent energy is directed upwards, it activates the higher centers of the brain, entering the realm of spirit or cosmic or unity consciousness represented by the heavenly flight of the bird. In the solar cult of Serpent and Phallus found at Chichen Itza, the term Quetzalcoatl or Kukulkan was not a reference to a god, but was a title for the grade of a master within the cult's initiatic school. These were individuals who were highly evolved and emerged triumphant from the initiation rites at Chichen Itza, worthy of leading their people. I discovered that the initiation process is outlined in detail in the symbology that is inscribed upon the stone carvings on the temples at Chichen Itza. Those Quetzalcans who possessed absolute control over the beast within them took their rightful place upon the jaguar throne, which represented this mastery. As I looked at the photos of the initiation process outlined in the imagery carved into the stone walls, the last part of the process was of most interest to me, as it depicted in this imagery that once individuals were fully purified through their training, a new initiate would stand before and dialogue with a Quetzalcan or Kukulkan who was enthroned in the clouds. And the image of the Birdman that I had witnessed in the clouds during the eclipse the night before now took on an immense significance for me. So in the weeks after, I continued to travel through other temple sites throughout Mexico and continued to have many other profound experiences. And when I returned home to Australia several weeks later, I was delighted to find that Marilyn Toonshon's second book awaited me in my mailbox, the rainbow serpent of the Toltecs, Don Juan and the art of sexual energy. Having had the encounter with her at Chichen Itza, I was eager to read the book, and I was keen to find out when she'd be running other workshops that I could attend, as I wished to apprentice with her. However, when I searched for her details on the internet, I sadly found that after she had just finished writing her third book, this one here, The Twilight Language of the Nawal, that she announced that this was to be the conclusion of her teachings, with no more public appearances, the 3 books being her legacy before she departed this world shortly thereafter. So guided by the light of the morning star, this entire journey through Mexico had been an ongoing initiation for me. It was about remembering a past life connection to an ancient lineage of initiates from the Cosmic University of Chichen Itza and the associated teachings of Quetzalcoatl. This awakening of remembrance about the function of Kundalini activation in the process of self-realization, purification and transformation was to continually unfold when I return to Australia, of which I will present more in future presentations. I hope that you have enjoyed this lengthy presentation and taken something of value away from it. If you'd like to continue this journey with me in more episodes of Future Self Dreaming, please hit the subscribe button, and you can check out offerings on the website futureselfdreaming.com and follow Future Self Dreaming on Instagram and Facebook. In Lakesh.